Mississippi, 1857. The night air carried the scent of burning magnolia and damp soil. Inside the Harlow plantation house, a man knelt before a closed door, his hands shaking, whispering the name of a woman who could never answer him. Neighbors would later say they heard a gunshot. Others swore they saw candlelight flicker through every window at once, as if the house itself had caught fire from guilt. But to understand that night, the night when love turned into ruin, we must go back to the beginning, to the heart of a world built on chains, pride, and silence. The man who owned everything would soon discover the one thing he could never possess. At the center of this story was Thomas Harlow, a man who inherited wealth and land from generations of privilege. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed the world existed to obey him. To his neighbors, he was elegant, devout, generous, a model of Southern gentility. Yet beneath the tailored suits and polite bow, there was a man haunted by desire, guilt, and a hunger he could not name. He could command men and money, but he could not control what stirred in his own heart. Thomas's wife, Margaret Harlow, arrived at the plantation in her late 20s, a product of Virginia high society. To outsiders, she was the embodiment of composure, high cheekbones, carefully pinned hair, eyes that measured every word before it was spoken. Yet Margaret's life was a series of quiet compromises. She married not for love, but for lineage, wealth, and social expectation. Her husband's attention had long been erratic, sometimes distant, sometimes frighteningly intense. Margaret had learned to mask suspicion behind polite conversation. A raised eyebrow or tightened hand could conceal the turmoil of a woman who knew that, in a household governed by absolute power, curiosity could be dangerous. She knew something was stirring in her home, something no etiquette book could teach her to navigate. Then there was Eliza, born into bondage under the Harlow name, though she carried none of its privilege. Barely 20, she had the grace of someone who had survived hardship by learning every subtle rule of observation. Her life had been shaped by silence and strategy, each glance, each step, each whispered word calculated for survival. Yet even in restraint, there was dignity. Even in labor, a quiet defiance. Eliza's earliest memories were of cotton fields stretching like oceans, overseers' boots stamping the ground, and the rare moments when a hymn could carry her mind beyond the chain-link fences and unyielding soil. She remembered the smell of the river after rain, the taste of stolen figs from the orchard, and the quiet warmth of human connection in a world that denied her freedom. And though the plantation tried to claim her body, it could not steal her mind. Thomas first noticed Eliza not in the fields, but in the plantation chapel. She sang a hymn beneath her breath, polishing the pews with hands scarred by work yet trembling with purpose. It was not a melody meant to be heard, it was a soft rebellion, a small act of courage, and Thomas, despite himself, could not look away. He told himself he admired her strength. He told himself he was moved by her faith. History would see something else, a man struggling to reconcile power, obsession, and guilt. In that moment, he crossed a line he did not yet understand, and neither did she. Margaret, for all her composure, noticed the shift in Thomas. Subtle changes, lingering looks, unasked questions, a sudden interest in Eliza's quiet movements. She observed, she calculated, she waited. Margaret understood the danger not only to her household's reputation but to the fragile human lives that depended on Thomas's judgment. She began keeping her own watch, discreetly following footsteps through halls, listening to whispered conversations in the kitchen, noting the position of a candle at night. Margaret's attention to detail was not merely curiosity, it was survival. She would not act yet, but she knew, a storm was coming, and she intended to survive it. Eliza herself felt the change. The master's eyes lingered longer than decorum should allow, his tone softer than the harshness she had learned to anticipate. Yet Eliza had learned the hard truth, attention from a man who owned your life was never a gift, it was a threat. She maintained distance, politeness, and caution, her every smile measured, her every word a shield. And she wondered quietly, each night as she lay on her narrow mattress, how long before mercy becomes danger. Thomas's internal struggle was complex. He prided himself on justice, religion, and reason, yet he was ensnared by an emotion he could not define. Compassion? Admiration? Obsession? It was a tangle of guilt, power, and unspoken desire that gnawed at him during sermons, in candlelit rooms, and across endless fields of cotton. Every act of kindness toward Eliza became a moral trap, each acknowledgement of her humanity a step closer to his own ruin. He thought he could control it all, but human hearts do not obey lawbooks or scripture. The plantation itself mirrored this tension. The field stretched like a vast chessboard, where every worker was a piece, every overseer a watchful eye, and every master a player unaware of how quickly the game could turn. The house was large and imposing, with polished floors, high ceilings, and portraits of ancestors who had built wealth on the backs of the enslaved. Yet the opulence could not hide the whispers, the fearful glances, the stories that grew in shadow. Every corner of the Harlow estate held a secret, waiting to ignite. Layering this all together, we see three lives caught in collision: Thomas, blinded by obsession and guilt; Margaret, sharp, calculating, and wary; Eliza, resilient, intelligent, and fiercely human. Each one's choices were shaped by power, fear, and survival, and none could see the consequences that waited like a storm beyond the horizon. And soon, the fragile balance that held the plantation together would shatter, and no one could predict who would survive the wreckage. The Harlow plantation was a world built on contradiction. To outsiders, it was wealth, order, and refinement. To those who labored under its authority, it was suffocating, unyielding, and perilous. Fields stretched endlessly under the relentless sun, each row of cotton a silent testament to generations of toil. Overseers moved like shadows, cracking whips and barking orders, their eyes sharp for missteps that might cost a life, or at least a body marked with scars. Within the mansion, etiquette masked tension. Margaret moved gracefully, a porcelain observer of her husband's moods and her household's whispers. She understood that power, in this place, was a constant, silent threat. One word could ruin reputations. One misstep could change the course of life and death. Eliza, in contrast, had learned to read every glance, every footstep, every slight shift in tone. Her world was one of constant calculation, small resistances, and survival strategies that kept her alive and human. Even in the kitchen, her work precise and silent, she remained vigilant, aware of the master's gaze and the subtle signs of his obsession. Yet beneath all this structure, a fragile tension grew, like a storm behind the horizon. Jealousy, fear, ambition, and desire, twisted by the cruelty of the system, built invisible walls between each character, walls that could not hold forever. And in this house of silent rules and hidden dangers, a single misstep could ignite chaos that no one could contain. The plantation operated as a world within a world. Even meals were a stage of hierarchy. The family ate in silver and linen, the workers in shadowed rooms with stolen scraps. Every glance across the table, every whispered word in the hallway, carried meaning. Thomas attempted to maintain control, but his fixation on Eliza, masked as compassion, was visible to everyone who watched closely. Margaret noticed it first, the subtle hesitation in his commands when she was near, the way he lingered on a glance or a smile. The enslaved workers also noticed. Rumors moved like fire through the quarters. Fear mixed with hope, suspicion mixed with whispers of rebellion. In a place where lives were bound by law and custom, secrets became weapons, and loyalty was fragile. And while Thomas believed he ruled this world, there were forces he could not see, forces gathering silently, ready to change everything. One evening, as twilight descended over the cotton fields, a letter appeared. Not in the mail, there was no mail, but slipped through the cracks of a loose floorboard in the kitchen. Eliza discovered it first, a folded note with a hurried hand and smudged ink. It was meant to be hidden, yet the message was unmistakable: someone was plotting. Whether for rebellion, escape, or personal gain, it was a spark in a tinderbox. Thomas sensed the shift immediately. The air in the house felt heavier. He could see it in Margaret's eyes, carefully measured, quietly dangerous. And he could feel it in Eliza, though she tried to hide it, the knowledge that her life, and the lives of those around her, were teetering on the edge of an unseen precipice. That night, the first argument erupted between Thomas and Margaret, a clash of pride, suspicion, and fear. Words like weapons cut the calm facade of the Harlow household. Meanwhile, Eliza returned to the shadows of the kitchen, carrying the letter in silence, aware that this small piece of paper might change everything. No one knew whose hand had placed the letter there, or what would happen when its secret finally surfaced. The plantation, which had once functioned like clockwork, began to creak under the weight of tension. Workers whispered of escape plans and hidden alliances. Margaret weighed her options carefully, considering whether to confront her husband or protect herself. Thomas, unaware of the true implications of the letter, oscillated between panic, curiosity, and obsession. He tried to maintain control over the world he believed he owned, but the growing threat of secrets, rebellion, and moral exposure began to suffocate him. In this moment, the delicate equilibrium of the plantation shattered, setting the stage for a chain of events that would test loyalty, courage, and the very boundaries of justice and mercy within the walls of Harlow Estate. And in the shadow of cotton and candlelight, each life hung precariously, waiting for the first spark to ignite a fire no one could contain. As night fell over the Harlow plantation, the air grew thick with unspoken fear. Thomas could feel it in his chest, a restless weight he could not explain. The letter had become more than paper, it was a mirror, reflecting every flaw, every obsession, every moral failing he had ever tried to hide. Margaret, in her chamber, paced silently. Each step echoed in the hall, each glance toward her husband weighed with suspicion. She understood that Thomas's fascination with Eliza was no longer a simple distraction. It was a disruption, a dangerous imbalance that threatened not only her marriage but the fragile order of their entire household. Eliza, meanwhile, moved like a shadow through the kitchen, her fingers tracing the edge of the note she had discovered. She had choices, few and perilous, but she understood the stakes. Any misstep, any hint of defiance, could end in punishment or death. And yet, she could not ignore the letter's warning. It hinted at secrets, conspiracies, and power plays that could change everything. Each heartbeat in the house felt louder than the last, as if the walls themselves held their breath, waiting for the inevitable collision. Thomas's obsession with control and observation deepened. He began to see Eliza everywhere, in the fields, in the chapel, even in the reflections of polished silver in the dining hall. But it was not love in its purest form, it was a desperate attempt to master a world that was increasingly slipping through his fingers. Margaret observed him too, noting the twitch of his hand, the furrow of his brow, the way he lingered in the hallway when Eliza passed. She began to record everything in her mind, a ledger of signs and suspicions. Every gesture, every word, every pause was a piece of the puzzle, and she intended to solve it before disaster struck. Eliza, fully aware of the attention she commanded, did not waver in her resolve. Her life had taught her caution, patience, and strategy. She understood that her survival depended on reading not just the master's moods, but the shifting loyalties of all those around her, enslaved and free alike. And in the quiet moments between candlelight and shadow, each of them realized, the balance of power was changing, and no one was safe from its pull. The first fracture came unexpectedly. One evening, an overheard conversation in the servants' quarters revealed that the letter was part of a larger secret. Someone within the house was plotting to expose Thomas's obsession, and by extension, the hypocrisies of the entire plantation system. Thomas confronted Eliza that night, in the dim glow of the hallway. His voice was low, almost pleading, but beneath it trembled desperation. He wanted answers, control, assurance. But the attempt only revealed his vulnerability. Eliza, calm and measured, did not respond with fear. She met his gaze steadily, letting the weight of truth hang between them. For the first time, Thomas realized that no amount of wealth, status, or power could force compliance where the mind refused. Meanwhile, Margaret watched from the shadows, silently witnessing the confrontation. Her suspicion confirmed, her plan for survival crystallized. She understood now that her marriage, the household, and every life in the plantation could unravel at any moment. The balance of authority, obsession, and secrecy had shifted irrevocably. The first domino had fallen, and with it, the path toward disaster had begun. That night, in the candlelit hallway of the Harlow mansion, each life was changed forever, and none of them could predict who would rise and who would fall when the storm finally broke. The days that followed the confrontation were marked by unease, whispered fears, and unseen shifts of power. The plantation that once moved with mechanical precision now felt fragile, like a glass vase teetering on the edge of a table. Thomas tried to assert authority, pacing the hallways, issuing commands, inspecting fields, but every attempt at control only highlighted his obsession. His attention to Eliza had become impossible to hide, and the workers whispered behind closed doors, sensing the tension that even Margaret could not fully conceal. Margaret, resolute and cunning, began maneuvering behind the scenes. She gathered intelligence from the household staff, noting inconsistencies in reports, small acts of defiance, and any indication that Thomas's fixation could endanger the plantation, or her own life. Eliza moved carefully, her every step measured. She understood that chaos could be both a threat and a weapon. The power she wielded was subtle: knowledge, patience, and the ability to survive. She whispered advice, feigned ignorance, and played the careful game that kept her alive in a world determined to crush her. The house, once a symbol of order and wealth, had become a pressure cooker, and no one knew which spark would make it explode. The other enslaved workers began acting with caution. Some whispered of escape, others watched silently, waiting to see who would falter first. Fear and curiosity spread through the quarters like wildfire. Meanwhile, Thomas's obsession grew darker. He could no longer distinguish morality from desire. Compassion had become compulsion, guilt had become fascination. And with each day, he inched closer to a choice that could destroy lives, his own included. Every glance, every gesture, every secret note brought them all closer to a moment from which there could be no return. One evening, a storm rolled over the Mississippi fields. Rain lashed the windows, wind rattled the shutters, and thunder shook the plantation like a warning. Inside, the household mirrored the tempest outside. Thomas confronted Eliza again, this time with desperation overtaking control. His voice, low and pleading, revealed the obsession he had tried to hide. He begged for answers, explanations, assurances that were impossible to give. Eliza met him with calm resolve, her gaze unwavering. In her silence was a force more powerful than wealth, more unyielding than chains: her mind, her dignity, her humanity. Thomas realized, finally, that his power was an illusion, that his obsession could never grant him control over her spirit. Margaret, standing just beyond the threshold, watched silently. She had prepared for confrontation, for chaos, for ruin, but even she could not anticipate the depth of Thomas's unraveling. Her mind raced, weighing options, calculating survival, and planning the moment when she might turn the tide in her favor.